Suppose you travel back to the winter of 1932 Southside Chicago, becoming Thomas Donovan, an Irish-American bakery owner. How do you spend a day? The bone-chilling wind carrying the gasps of the unemployed lashed against the bakery's tattered wooden door again and again. In the darkness of 4 o'clock in the morning you rose clutching your worn-out axe, the oven's residual warmth long gone. The livelihood of your family and the hopes of your neighbors all rested on every piece of dough you needed in this desperate time. Cold wind seeping through the cracks in the attic floorboards pricked your bare arms like tiny ice needles. You snapped awake. Not from the cold but from Eileen's stifled moans pulling you back to reality. She lay curled on her side, her joints swollen like risen dough from rheumatoid arthritis, trembling with sharp pain at the slightest movement. You got up on tiptoe, afraid to disturb both Eileen and Martha sleeping in the living room. The attic was too freezing. The two children huddled in the living room, surviving Chicago's bitter winter by the fireplace's dying embers. Your fingertips brushed the patches on your coat, sewn by Eileen last year from an old sweater lined with extra fleece. The fleece at the cuffs and collar couldn't hold off the wind. The cold still pierced through the fabric to gnaw at your bones. In your coat pocket were only 3 crumpled coins, the wages Michael earned from unloading goods yesterday. The meager sum wasn't even enough for a small box of yeast. The suffocating weight of survival pressed down on you. The wooden stairs creaked with each step, bearing the relentless burden of daily subsistence. Your exhaustion had nothing to do with lack of sleep. For 3 years of the Great Depression, the bakery had hung on like a candle in the wind. Pushing open the bakery door, a mixed scent of flour, charcoal, and old wood washed over you. This 12-year-old familiar aroma once brought you comfort. Now it only filled you with endless anxiety. The cast-iron oven in the back room was icy cold. It needed 2 hours of preheating to reach the right temperature. You swung the axe to split firewood, the sound shattering the dawn silence, each blow draining your last ounce of strength. The old injury in your wrist throbbed faintly. A searing pain flaring up from a steel mill burn that always acted up in the cold. Flames flickered to life in the hearth, their faint glow illuminating your face lined with wrinkles and hardship. You stayed by the oven, stoking the fire, silently calculating the ingredients you were short of today. Pushing open the ajar storage room door, you counted the remaining supplies by the fire's dim light. Only half a bag of flour bought on credit, a small chunk of butter, and a tiny packet of scarce yeast were left. You decided to focus on rye bread to save yeast, with only 10 loaves of white bread available, cash only. The cinnamon rolls Martha had been craving would have to wait, shelved for lack of ingredients. Your fingers lingered on the half-empty flour bag, your thoughts drifting back to the bakery's prosperous days before the Depression. Back then ingredients were abundant. 2 batches of white bread baked daily and cinnamon rolls sold out as soon as they came out of the oven. Michael went to school and played ball. Eileen was healthy enough to help in the shop, and Martha's tuition was never overdue. The stock market crash swept everything away like a tsunami. Factories closed down and putting food on the table became a daily struggle. More and more customers bought on credit, ingredients prices soared, savings dried up, and you survived only by begging suppliers for credit. A sharp knock on the door interrupted your reverie. Your heart sank. You knew it must be John, your supplier. Opening the door, you saw John standing there with flour and butter, his face grimmer than the cold wind outside. John confessed this was the last time he could deliver goods. You had to pay off part of the debt next week. He looked helpless, saying his own boy needed to eat. He simply couldn't extend credit any longer. You thanked him repeatedly, embarrassed to explain the bread money would barely cover Eileen's painkillers. You begged for a few more days of grace, promising to bring the money as soon as Michael earned his wages tomorrow. John sighed, patted your shoulder, and turned to step into the vast dark night. Watching his retreating figure, your heart was a jumble of emotions. In these troubled times, everyone was struggling to stay afloat in the sea of suffering. The oven reached the right temperature. You poured in rye flour, added yeast and warm water, and bent over to knead the dough with all your might. The coarse rye flour was tough to knead. The old pain in your wrist flared up and sweat mixed with dust streaked your face. As you kneaded, you mentally listed the regular customers. Unemployed George, Mary, and the priest would be coming. Michael stumbled in, his face flushed with cold, reeking of coal smoke from the train station. He handed you a few coins, muttering that the foreman said there might be no work next week. Your heart ached as you touched his icy hands. At 16, he should have been in school, not working to support the family. You told Michael to warm up and eat something, asking him to stay and help in the shop instead of going out again today. Staring at his thin, coal-dusted figure, you clenched your fist, vowing to hold onto this bakery no matter what. You set the kneaded dough in a ceramic basin to rise, then leaned against the oven, staring blankly at the flickering flames. Overdue loans, dwindling ingredients, medical bills, tuition fees. Problems piled up like a mountain, weighing you down. You were the pillar of your family and the community. No matter how hard it got, you couldn't afford to fall. You divided the risen dough into portions, shaped them skillfully, and arranged them on baking trays ready for the oven. Martha woke up, rubbing her eyes, wearing an oversized old coat, and walked over to you, asking to help. At 12, she was already so sensible, wiping the counters without a single complaint about the hard times. She asked in a soft voice if you could make cinnamon rolls, her eyes filled with long-suppressed longing. Overwhelmed with guilt, you patted her head, promising to bake a whole batch as soon as business picked up. Though disappointed, Martha nodded obediently, whispering that she would wait for the cinnamon rolls Dad would make. The first tray of rye bread went into the oven. The rich aroma of wheat gradually filled the shop, chasing away the chill and gloom. You sat behind the counter, watching the oven, praying that you could sell more bread today and earn some cash. Even a little extra money would ease the desperate tightness of your current situation. The bread in the oven slowly turned golden brown, its dark crust exuding an irresistible aroma of wheat. The scent, almost alive, seeped through the cracks of the bakery door and drifted onto the quiet street. Dawn broke. The scene outside the window grew clearer. A thin layer of snow covered the narrow street. The street lamps were still on, their dim yellow light glinting faintly off the snow. In the distance, a long line had formed outside the soup kitchen. People huddled in tattered clothes, shivering in the wind. Their faces were etched with exhaustion and numbness, waiting for a meager bowl of porridge to fill their stomachs. Occasionally, tramps shuffled past on the street, their shoes in tatters barely covering their feet. Some even walked barefoot on the snow, leaving a trail of messy footprints behind them. Clutching empty lunch boxes or cloth bags, they scanned the street with hollow eyes, searching for any scraps of food. A dull siren blared from a distant factory, cutting through the morning silence. It was one of the few factories still operational. Those who worked there were the lucky ones in this era. Martha finished wiping the counters and arranged the remaining muffins in the glass display case. They were still in decent shape. She stood by the window, staring at the line of people, and asked you softly if they were starving. You walked over, patted her head, and stood beside her in silence, unable to find the right words. There were too many poor souls in this age. All you could do was offer what little help you could. A tinkling bell rang as the door was pushed open. Cold wind, swirling with snowflakes, rushed into the bakery. Martha shrank her neck instinctively. Standing at the door was Father James. He wore a well-worn black cassock, the cuffs and collar frayed at the edges, his face tired yet gentle. The priest rubbed his frozen hands and greeted you, his eyes falling on the oven as he praised the delicious smell of bread. You smiled back, turned around, and took the freshly baked rye bread out of the oven. You asked the priest how many loaves he wanted. He said 4 rye breads. Father James handed you a crumpled banknote, then hesitated, awkwardly asking if he could have 2 stale muffins as well. He explained there were 2 homeless children on the street corner who hadn't eaten for 2 days. They were truly pitiful. You refused to take his money, packed the 4 rye breads and 2 fresh muffins into a paper bag instead. You told him the muffins were a gift for the children, no need to pay for them. Father James quickly declined, saying he knew you weren't having an easy time either and didn't want to take things for free. You pressed his hand and shook your head, saying it was just for the children. It was nothing. You sighed, saying times were hard and helping others whenever you could was the right thing to do. Father James looked deeply grateful. After thanking you, he left. You knew he was heading to the soup kitchen to work. He had it far harder than you. Martha stood beside you, whispering that you were such a kind man. You smiled and patted her head. You told Martha that as long as we were alive, we must never lose our conscience. Around 7 o'clock, the street gradually became busier and more customers started coming to the bakery. The first customer was George, dressed in a tattered work uniform, the soles of his shoes worn through, exposing his toes. He stood in front of the counter, his face turning red, twisting the hem of his clothes, nervously, unable to speak for a long time. You saw his embarrassment and took the initiative, asking if he wanted the usual. George looked up, his eyes full of guilt, and begged to buy another rye bread on credit. He said he would pay you back as soon as he found a job, his voice trembling as he mustered up the courage to ask. You nodded, handed him the bread, and comforted him, saying jobs were hard to come by, but he would find one eventually. You picked up the account book and recorded the debt, your handwriting heavy with helplessness. George thanked you repeatedly and hurried off, eager to take the bread home to his children. George had barely left when Mary arrived with two skinny, undernourished children. Mary was dressed thinly and looked haggard. The children stared at the bread in the display case, swallowing hard. Mary asked softly for a corn muffin, holding out 3 rusty coins she had polished clean. Those 3 coins must have been saved up bit by bit over several days. You handed her the muffin, then quietly slipped half a loaf of rye bread into her hand as well. Mary froze for a moment and tried to refuse, saying she had only paid for the muffin. You told her it was a gift for the children, your heart aching at the thought of them going hungry when they needed to grow. Mary's eyes filled with tears. She choked out her thanks and bowed deeply with her children before leaving. Over the next few hours, customers came one after another, most buying the cheaper bread or asking to buy on credit. You did your best to meet their needs, even though it meant depleting your stock and increasing your debts. A few customers bought the limited white bread and paid cash, enough to buy some medicine for Eileen. Martha helped out sensibly, never rushing the customers or complaining about those who bought on credit. When some customers haggled over the price, Martha politely explained why she couldn't lower it any further. Martha's thoughtfulness warmed your heart, strengthening your resolve to hold onto the bakery. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the number of customers dwindled. You leaned against the counter and drank a sip of warm water to ease your exhaustion. The old pain in your wrist flared up and your waist and abdomen ached, all from hours of non-stop work. You looked at the remaining bread and calculated silently. Today's earnings would probably not even cover the cost of ingredients. The bakery door was suddenly pushed open with a bang. A man in a sharp suit walked in. The man who entered was Henry, a bank clerk wearing a neatly pressed dark gray suit, his tie and leather shoes polished to a shine. His hair was combed meticulously, his face wearing a cold professional expression, his eyes devoid of any warmth. Henry walked straight to the counter, rested his hands on it, and looked down at you, speaking in an icy, commanding tone. Thomas Donovan, we meet again. His words carried an air of finality, brooking no argument. Your heart sank like a stone. Your hand tightened around the water glass, your fingertips turning white with cold. You knew exactly why Henry was here. He had come last week to demand payment, refusing to grant you any extension. Good morning, Mr. Henry. You forced down the panic in your heart, trying your best to keep your voice steady. I'm not here for pleasantries. Henry's tone didn't soften in the slightest. He pulled a document out of his briefcase. He placed the document on the counter and slid it toward you, explaining it was the mortgage contract for the bakery. The contract had been overdue for 3 months. The bank was giving you one final week. Pay the debt in full or lose the bakery to foreclosure and auction. You picked up the document, your fingers trembling slightly. Every word on it felt like a sharp knife piercing your heart. This bakery was 12 years of your blood, sweat, and tears. It supported your family's livelihood and was the only bakery in the neighborhood. If you lost the bakery, you and your family would be homeless and the neighbors would no longer have access to warm bread. You looked at Henry and begged for more time, confessing that business had been terrible during the Depression and you simply couldn't scrape together such a large sum. Could you please give me a little more time? I promise I will find a way to pay off the debt. Your voice was filled with desperation. An extension? Henry let out a cold laugh, his eyes full of disdain, reminding you he had already given you a chance last week. He said countless shops had gone bankrupt during the Great Depression. The bank was not a charity and he was only doing his job by the book. Henry added that he advised you to start making preparations. He would come with his team in a week to take possession of the bakery, his tone unyielding, leaving no room for negotiation. The customers who hadn't left yet all stopped what they were doing, looking at you with sympathy in their eyes. George happened to be among them. Upon hearing Henry's words, he flew into a rage, clenched his fists, and was about to step forward to argue. George demanded to know why Henry was being so unreasonable, pointing out that Thomas was not refusing to pay. He just didn't have the money right now. He begged the bank to show some leniency. You quickly stopped George, shaking your head slightly to signal him not to lose his temper, afraid of making the situation worse.
Georges donc.
You turned to Henry, your voice laced with helplessness, promising to find a way to resolve the issue. Henry glanced at George, then back at you, curling his lips into a cold smile. He picked up his briefcase and turned to leave. As soon as the door closed, your legs gave way. You leaned against the counter, your chest tight, struggling to catch your breath. George walked over and patted your shoulder to comfort you, suggesting that the neighbors pool their money to help you pay off the bank debt. You looked into George's sincere eyes, warmth flooding your heart, but shook your head, refusing to trouble everyone further. You knew all your neighbors were struggling just to put food on the table. They had no extra money to spare, and you didn't want to add to their burden. The customers all came over to offer a few words of comfort before leaving one by one. Soon only you and Martha were left in the bakery. The air was thick with suffocating gloom. Martha tugged at the hem of your clothes, asking in a small voice if the bakery was going to be taken away. "Dad, are they going to take our bakery away?" Fear and anxiety were written all over her face. You knelt down and hugged Martha tightly, whispering words of comfort, promising to hold onto the bakery, no matter what, vowing never to let the family become homeless. But even as you spoke the words, you felt a flicker of doubt in your heart. 1 week was not nearly enough time to raise such a large sum of money. Just as you were at a loss for what to do, the sound of horse hooves grew closer, stopping right outside the bakery door. You looked up and saw old Tom driving his tattered horse-drawn cart loaded with potatoes and cabbages. Old Tom's hair was gray, his face crinkled with wrinkles. He wore a thick sheepskin coat, looking simple and honest. He pushed open the door and walked in with a smile, holding a small sack in his hand, greeting you warmly and saying he had brought you something. You quickly stood up, forcing a smile, and greeted him, confused as to why he had come by so suddenly. Old Tom sighed and explained that the harvest had been poor and he couldn't sell his crops. He wanted to trade them for some bread to feed his family. These vegetables would just rot if left unsold. Better to trade them for bread to fill empty stomachs. It was better than letting them go to waste. Your eyes lit up. Bartering was common during the Great Depression, and these vegetables would save your family a lot of money on groceries. "That would be great, old Tom. Thank you so much." You agreed happily, asking how much bread he wanted. 5 loaves of rye bread would be perfect. "You can take as many potatoes and cabbages as you need," old Tom said. He unloaded a sack of potatoes and 2 cabbages, adding that he would bring some eggs next week if he could. You handed him 5 loaves of rye bread, then took an extra corn muffin and gave it to him, telling him to take it home for the children. Old Tom tried to refuse several times, but you insisted, saying we were old friends and there was no need to stand on ceremony. Old Tom thanked you profusely, took the bread, and drove his cart slowly away from the bakery. Looking at the potatoes and cabbages on the counter, you let out a small sigh of relief. At least the family wouldn't go hungry for the next few days. Martha clapped her hands in joy, bouncing on her toes and saying excitedly, "Dad, we get to eat potatoes today." You smiled and patted her head, but your heart was still heavy with worry. The bank debt remained a daunting, unresolved problem. As it neared 10 o'clock, a special customer arrived. A boy of 15 or 16, leaning against the counter and peering inside. His clothes were tattered, and he walked barefoot on the icy cold floor, his ankles exposed, his skin red and swollen from the cold. His hair was messy, his face covered in grime, but his eyes were bright, staring intently at the corn muffins in the glass display case. You noticed his hand creeping slowly toward the corner of the counter where a few corn muffins were placed, his movements cautious and light. The boy's eyes were filled with tension and hesitation. It was clear he was starving, tempted to steal a muffin to satisfy his hunger. Martha also noticed something was wrong. She tugged at your sleeve and whispered a warning. "Dad, he's trying to steal the bread." Instead of scolding him, you picked up half a loaf of rye bread and held it out to him, speaking in a gentle voice. "Here you go, kid. Eat this." The boy froze, looking up in shock. His eyes were filled with surprise and wariness, and he took a step back instinctively. You placed the bread in his hand. "Take it, I know you're hungry. Eat slowly, and there's more if you want." The boy stared at the bread, then back at you. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he began to gobble it down hungrily. He mumbled something indistinct between bites. Though you couldn't make out the words, you could tell he was expressing his gratitude. After he finished eating, you poured him a glass of warm water. He drank it slowly, his emotions gradually calming down. The boy whispered his story. His hometown had been hit by a severe drought, his parents had passed away, and he was wandering alone hoping to find work out west. Your heart ached for him. Homeless boys like him were everywhere during the Great Depression, struggling to survive the harsh winter, their fates uncertain. You gave him another whole loaf of rye bread, telling him the soup kitchen would be serving soup in the afternoon and he could go there to wait. The boy clutched the bread tightly, bowed deeply to thank you, and ran out of the bakery, disappearing into the crowd on the street corner. Martha looked puzzled, asking, "Dad, we don't even have enough bread for ourselves. Why did you give him so much?" You patted her head and explained that no matter how hard times got, we must always hold on to our kindness. We couldn't lose our conscience just because we were struggling to survive. Martha nodded thoughtfully, a glimmer of understanding in her eyes, and didn't ask any more questions. The morning slipped away. The bread was almost gone, only a few stale muffins and half a loaf of rye bread remained. You told Martha to go home for lunch first, saying you would stay and mind the shop and take the chance to sort out the account book. The account book showed mounting debts and meager earnings. The cold, hard numbers made you feel lost, unsure if you could survive this crisis. Noon sunlight streamed through the bakery window, casting dappled shadows on the floor, but it did little to dispel the chill in the air. The number of pedestrians on the street dwindled as people went home for lunch. Only the line outside the soup kitchen stretched on, broken by occasional coughs and complaints. You leaned back in your chair and rubbed your aching waist. The old pain in your wrist still throbbed faintly, exhaustion washing over your entire body. You had been busy since early morning without even a sip of water. Now you finally had a chance to rest your tense nerves, relaxing slightly. You picked up the glass of warm water on the table and took a sip, the dryness in your throat easing, bringing a small measure of comfort to your body and mind. The bakery door suddenly opened. Eileen walked in holding a lunchbox, her face pale, her steps slow and unsteady, clearly in pain from her arthritis. You quickly stood up and rushed over to greet her, taking the lunchbox from her hands, your voice filled with concern as you asked why she had come all this way. Eileen smiled and sat down, rubbing her knees gently. Her voice was soft, tinged with tiredness, saying she had nothing to do at home and wanted to bring you lunch. She added that Martha had already eaten and was doing her homework in the back room, telling you to eat quickly before the food got cold. You opened the lunchbox. Inside were 2 roasted potatoes, a small piece of rye bread, and a glass of warm water. This was the family's lunch, simple and plain, but it was the best they could afford under the circumstances. You took a bite of the roasted potato, its soft, fluffy texture mixed with a hint of charred aroma. Eileen had roasted it with the last of the charcoal. You smiled and told Eileen how delicious it was, deliberately keeping your tone light to hide the sadness in your heart. Eileen looked at you with worry in her eyes, asking if something was wrong, if the bank had sent someone to demand payment again. You paused for a moment, then told her calmly that Henry had been here, giving you only 1 week to pay off the debt or lose the bakery. Eileen's face turned as white as a sheet. She clasped her hands tightly, her eyes filling with fear, her voice trembling as she said the bakery couldn't be lost. She suggested pawning her jewelry to raise some money. Even though it wasn't worth much, she wanted to do whatever she could to help. You shook your head, took her cold, rough hands in yours, and told her with guilt that she had already pawned her jewelry to buy flour long ago. Eileen burst into tears, leaning her head on your shoulder, whispering that she didn't blame you, saying she would face the hardship with you. Worst case scenario, they could move to the countryside. You hugged Eileen tightly, warmth surging in your heart, grateful that you had her by your side through these difficult times, never leaving your side. You whispered a promise that you would face this together, vowing to find a way out, swearing never to let the children become homeless. The bakery door opened once more. Frank, the grocery store owner, walked in with a heavy expression, holding a cloth bag in his hand. Frank asked in a low voice for a loaf of rye bread, lacking his usual cheerful demeanor. You stood up, took the last half loaf of rye bread from the glass display case and handed it to him, telling him to take it if he didn't mind it being the last one. Frank took the bread and sighed, telling you the terrible news that Baker's Bakery had gone bankrupt and the owner had fled town with all the money. Your heart sank. Baker's Bakery was larger and had been in business for many years. You couldn't believe it had also failed to survive the hard times. You asked in shock if it was true, finding it hard to accept this sudden turn of events. Frank confirmed the news, sighing that times were truly tough, urging you to hold on. The entire neighborhood was counting on you. You nodded in response, but your anxiety grew. Problems piled up like a mountain, pressing down on you until you could barely breathe. Frank saw the worry on your face, patted your shoulder, and comforted you, saying he would do whatever he could to help, then turned and left the bakery. After Frank left, the bakery fell silent again. The atmosphere was so heavy it felt suffocating. Eileen whispered words of comfort, telling you not to think too much, firmly believing that the two of you would get through this difficult period together. You nodded, saying nothing, picked up the account book and checked the income and expenses. The meager earnings were far from enough to cover the cost of ingredients. Staring at the cold, hard numbers in the account book, frustration welled up inside you. You slammed the book down on the counter in anger. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed. Michael ran in, clutching a handful of banknotes, his face glowing with excitement, saying he had found a job that paid double wages. Your eyes lit up. Double wages was like manna from heaven. It would ease the pressure of the debt and give you a chance to ask for more time. You grabbed his hands in excitement, your eyes filled with hope, telling him to work hard and above all to be careful. Michael nodded, proudly promising to go to work early tomorrow to earn more money to help pay off the family's debts. You patted his head, feeling a mix of heartache and pride. At 16, this young boy had already taken on the heavy burden of supporting the family. You told Michael to go eat first, then asked him to go to the soup kitchen to help the neighbors after lunch, and finally to buy some painkillers for Eileen. Michael took the coins and ran out of the bakery. Watching his retreating figure, a glimmer of hope reignited in your heart. Eileen broke into a rare smile, saying Michael had grown up and could now share the burden. Things were bound to get better. You took her hand and nodded. The two of you encouraged each other, firmly believing that you would get through the hard times eventually. The noon sun shone down on your bodies, bringing a faint warmth and illuminating the slim yet steadfast hope in your hearts. The afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, streaming through the bakery window, casting long shadows across the floor. The street grew busier again, mostly with people coming out of the soup kitchen, clutching empty lunch boxes, their faces etched with disappointment at not getting enough to eat. The bakery was completely sold out of bread. You placed the few remaining muffins on the counter, waiting for any last-minute customers. You sat behind the counter, gazing out the window, your mind finally at peace. Though the debt still loomed, there was a glimmer of hope to ease the pressure. Michael would earn double wages tomorrow, and old Tom would bring eggs next week to trade for bread. This would help improve the family's meals. You thought to yourself, maybe if you just held on a little longer, the current difficulties would gradually ease. A tinkling bell rang as the door opened. Lucy walked in, once a well-known seamstress in the neighborhood. After the Great Depression hit, her tailor shop went bankrupt and she was forced to scrape by on odd jobs, barely making ends meet. Lucy was dressed in a thin, tattered dress, her hair dry and yellow, her face pale and haggard. She clutched a wool coat in her hands. She walked up to the counter, gave you a shy smile, and greeted you. "Good afternoon, Thomas." You smiled back and asked her what she needed, your tone warm and natural. Lucy held out the coat and said softly that she had mended the frayed cuffs and collar for you, adding extra fleece for warmth. You took the coat and examined it closely. The stitches were neat and tight, the fabric soft to the touch. You could tell she had put a lot of time and effort into it. Warmth filled your heart. You thanked Lucy repeatedly, your words overflowing with gratitude for her thoughtful gesture. Lucy waved her hand shyly, then mustered up the courage to ask if she could trade the coat for 2 loaves of bread. Her family had run out of food. Touched by her kindness, remembering you even in her own time of need, you turned around and took 3 loaves of rye bread, handing them to her. Lucy froze in surprise and tried to refuse, saying she only wanted 2 loaves, feeling the coat wasn't worth 3. You insisted she take them, telling her she was a talented seamstress and would surely reopen her shop once times got better. Lucy clutched the bread tightly, her eyes filling with tears. She choked out her thanks, deeply moved by your kindness in this difficult time. You smiled and said neighbors should help each other, urging her to let you know as soon as she reopened her tailor shop. Lucy nodded, wiped away her tears, thanked you again, and ran out of the bakery. Watching her retreating figure, a warm feeling lingered in your heart. Michael burst in suddenly, his face filled with anxiety, shouting that something terrible had happened at the soup kitchen. People had started fighting over the scarce food. Your heart tightened. Food shortages were common, but fights breaking out were rare and dangerous. You stood up, immediately grabbed the remaining muffins and breadcrumbs, told Martha to mind the shop, and rushed to the soup kitchen with Michael. Along the way, you saw many people running toward the soup kitchen, their faces anxious, chattering loudly about the chaos unfolding there. The scene outside the soup kitchen was utter pandemonium. People were shoving and arguing. Two men were engaged in a fistfight, and the onlookers' attempts to intervene were futile. Father James was doing his best to calm everyone down, but his voice was drowned out by the noise. Even the staff were overwhelmed and unable to regain control. You shouted loudly to get everyone's attention, pushed your way through the crowd to the center, with Michael helping to hold back the shoving people. You held the bread and breadcrumbs high above your head, urging everyone to remember they were all in the same boat. First, let's share this food and fill our empty stomachs. The chaos gradually subsided. Everyone's eyes fixed on the food in your hands, their gazes filled with longing and eagerness. You divided the food into small portions and distributed them one by one. George arrived just in time to help, reminding everyone to line up and take their turn. Father James thanked you profusely, saying that without you the situation would have escalated into something much worse. You replied to the priest that in these hard times, only by helping each other could everyone survive. After the food was distributed, the crowd's emotions calmed down. The two men who had been fighting apologized to each other, and everyone thanked you sincerely. You urged everyone to stay calm and communicate rationally when facing problems, then left the soup kitchen with Michael and George. On the way back, George and Michael praised you for your quick thinking. You smiled and said it was only right for neighbors to help each other. When you returned to the bakery, John was already waiting at the door, holding a small bag in his hand, his expression gentle. You thought he had come to demand payment and quickly begged for more time, promising to pay off the debt as soon as possible. John shook his head, denying he was here to collect the debt. He said he had pleaded with his boss and managed to get you a 2-week extension, handing you a bag of yeast to use. You were overjoyed, thanking him repeatedly. John sighed and said you had always held on to your kindness and you deserved to be treated with compassion. John wished you luck, saying he hoped flour prices would drop in the spring and your business would pick up, then turned and left. Michael and Martha were over the moon when they heard the news, celebrating the fact that the bakery would be able to stay open. The afternoon sun streamed into the humble bakery. Though ingredients were still scarce, your heart was filled with hope. Dusk fell over Southside Chicago. The street lamps flickered on and the cold wind swirled the snowflakes, whispering the hardships of the era. You baked one last batch of corn muffins in the bakery. The sweet aroma of wheat filled the air. Martha helped beside you, carefully arranging the freshly baked muffins on the tray, her eyes filled with anticipation. You comforted Martha, saying the muffins would sell out quickly, telling her to clean the counter and get ready to close up shop and go home. You cleaned out the oven and added a few more logs to keep it warm. This oven had been with you for 10 years, carrying the hopes of the entire family. Martha looked at the empty ingredient shelves, a worried expression on her face, asking what you would do if you ran out of flour and butter. You hugged Martha tightly and comforted her, listing all the possible ways to solve the ingredient shortage, soothing her anxious heart. Martha hugged you back, trusting your words, completely believing that things would get better and better. The doorbell rang once more. George ran in, out of breath, clutching a handful of banknotes, bringing the wonderful news that he had finally found a job.